everybody. Welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and this is part 3 of a series entitled Sound Quality and Authenticity in Heavy Metal and Hard Rock, Implications and Controversies. Right? So what I'm trying to do with this series is further the discussion on sound issues, what role sound issues play in your listening experience of heavy music, and how important authenticity might be, or the realness of music, right? For example, are you the type of person that the quality of the recording is really important, that it affects which albums you might listen to or which albums you might stream, right? Are you the type of person that gets kind of upset when you go to a live concert and then you realize that a whole lot of backing tracks were being used, that a lot of this is not really all that live, it's kind of a choreographed presentation? Also, does it bother you if you find out that maybe some of your favorite live albums were really overdubbed a whole lot in the studio, so they're not really all that live, not that authentic, you could argue, right? So I sort of set a lot of that up in part 1. We also discuss what is a typical good recording in terms of hard rock and heavy metal. What are some of the characteristics that we usually appreciate? Let's put it that way. So we talk about that. And then in part 2, I sort of look at the exceptions and say, all right, there are examples in hard rock and heavy metal where the recording might not be good in a conventional sense, and some people may indeed not even like these recordings at all, so it becomes controversial. But I make arguments there are times when recordings are non-conventional, but still completely appropriate for what the band is trying to achieve, right? And so I look at examples from Black Sabbath's catalog as well as some examples from Dark Throne. Now, in this episode, I'm going to kind of look at the other side of the coin. I think there are examples in hard rock, especially, but also heavy metal to some degree, where the production can be too good, right? Too pristine, to the point where it becomes so polished that it takes away some of the power from the bands, right? And again, this is controversial because, as it turns out, a lot of the most pristine recordings or productions in hard rock are often some of the biggest sellers, right? So obviously a lot of people like this, but maybe some longtime hardcore fans have problems with it, and certainly I often have problems with it. So again, there's a lot of controversy here. And in this episode, I'm especially going to focus on AC/DC, but as we'll see, there's lots of other examples I could bring in too, where I think there are times when the production, the sound of the recording goes a little too far into the super good category, if you want to put it that way. All right. So you can just read the essay if you'd rather do that, follow the links, or if you want to follow along with me, I'm sharing my screen as usual. So, was Mutt Lange right for AC/DC? I guess is the central question I'm going to ask in at least the first part of this presentation. Okay, well, from a commercial financial perspective, there is no denying that AC/DC reached a peak with their 3 albums produced by Mutt Lange. Okay? Highway to Hell, put out in 1979, Back in Black, put out in 1980, and For Those About to Rock, that came a year later. Okay, by any measure, Back in Black is amongst the very best-selling albums of all time. Right. And I'm not just talking best selling for AC/DC, best selling for anybody. Like if you go Google that, it's going to be, in the top 5 almost all the time. Right. I've seen, these things are measured sometimes in slightly different ways, but, sometimes it's just below, Michael Jackson's Thriller. Right. So it's up there. Right. Okay. And certainly also Highway to Hell and For Those About to Rock sold a whole lot as well. Like these are the big sellers in their catalog for the most part, right? Now, I'm certainly not arguing that these are bad albums. They're not. They're good albums. I enjoy them, right? Probably not as much as some people, but I still think they're good albums. I wonder, though, how much better each of these albums could have been in the hands of someone not obsessed with selling units to mainstream audiences. Because let's be honest, that was part of the reason that Mutt Lange was brought in, right? Because Lange is the epitome of a producer who's really concerned with pristine sounds. That's his thing. Guitars and drums are buffed to a glossy luster. Vocals are multi-layered to perfection. And any hint of rawness or edginess is painstakingly eliminated. That's the Lange approach. And I'm not saying that's wrong. It certainly works for a lot of different audiences, right? But it arguably wasn't right for AC/DC. Now, in fairness, Lange did not sweeten AC/DC's sound to the extent of other acts he worked with, okay? Now, again, this is stuff that's not in my listening zone at all, but if you compare, his not, and again, I haven't done a deep dive on this, but you don't have to listen to stuff very long to know where it's at, but stuff by Bryan Adams, Shania Twain, Foreigner, etc., right? So, he didn't sweeten AC/DC to that extent. But the transformation of Def Leppard is one that most definitely turned me away. Like, I didn't care about the other stuff because I don't listen to Bryan Adams, etc. anyway. But I did care about Def Leppard because I actually do like their first two albums quite a bit. Like, my all-time favorite by Def Leppard is by far On Through the Night, their first album. And High and Dry certainly has its moments. In fairness, though, Mutt Lange did produce that one. But anything after that, I'm kind of like, forget it. It's way too poppy, produced way too sweetly for me, right? Now, AC/DC's brand of hypercharged, blues-based hard rock is so innate to the key members, Malcolm and Angus Young in particular, right, that no producer, no matter how slick, could completely repress their musical genius for attaining charismatic simplicity. I don't know. That's how I hear AC/DC. They are definitely one of my favorite bands, and I think in their own way they are geniuses. So no producer could entirely wreck AC/DC, thankfully. However, if one compares the album's previous and then subsequent, Lange's influence is really quite striking, and I'll get into that a little more here. So for me personally, and again, I realize people might have an entirely different take on this, and that is absolutely 100% cool. But for me, the production team of Harry Vanda and George Young is the older brother of Malcolm and Angus. Malcolm, the great late Malcolm Young, who really is the leader of AC/DC, but George Young, the older brother. So the production team of Vanda and Young fit the AC/DC sound like a glove. It was just a perfect fit. All albums prior to Highway to Hell and later on with Blow Up Your Video, which was released in 1987, were produced by this duo, by Vanda and Young. And also Stiff Upper Lip, which came later in 2000, that was produced by George Young alone, right? Okay, so one could argue, I wouldn't make this argument, but I understand when people say this, that Jailbreak mini album from 75, High Voltage from 76. Now, whether you're talking about the North American compilation of High Voltage or the Australian High Voltage, which has different songs, and then also there's TNT, an album called TNT in Australia, those two were put together. The best songs were taken from that album and put on the North American release of High Voltage. So any of those albums, right? But they were all produced by Vanda and Young. And Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, right? So say anything from Dirty Deeds and back, some people will claim is a little too primitive, right? In the production and the approach. I wouldn't say that, but I get why some people would say that, right? However, I would argue, I think Let There Be Rock, the album put out in 1977, and Power Age, perhaps in particular, in 1978, are the definitive mixes for the band. And I'm not talking about performances or songs here. I'm talking about the way the albums sound. Although I would argue the songs and performances are amazing anyway, but the way they sound. I think Let There Be Rock and Power Age are the pinnacle of producing AC/DC, right? And also, I'm a huge fan of how Flick of the Switch, 1983, and Fly in the Wall sound, right? Now, these were produced internally by Malcolm and Angus. but it's pretty clear they took a lot of pointers from their older brother, right? Because it sounds a lot like a Vanda and Yun production. For some, they're too rough, especially coming off the Mutt Lange years. Those albums sound too rough. To me, they sound, that's how AC/DC should sound, right? I mean, a few of the characteristics of the Vanda and Yun or Yun and Yun approaches, these albums not only sound live in the studio, but it's almost like the band is playing in your listening room. Any AC/DC album steered by either Vanda and Yun or Yun and Yun resulted in a truly electric vibe in which you can often hear the hum of the amps and fingers on the fretboards. But no amount of clarity or sound stage is sacrificed in the process, right? So I think it's like just perfect mix for AC/DC. The tones are balanced beautifully. And especially, again, for a band that's about full-on rock and roll. Lots of trebly grit in the guitars and vocals, and there's full-sounding bass. And the rhythm section, i.e. the drums and bass guitar, is engineered in such a way that you just have to move something. So whether that be headbang along or toe tap dance, whatever you do. And also the other things I love about these mixes, the voices sound real. They're not processed, real, right? With no effort to hide the indispensable rasp of Bon Scott and later Brian Johnson, right? Or nothing, they're not trying to sweeten the appropriately flawed backup vocals of AC/DC, which always kind of make me chuckle because none of the guys in AC/DC can sing, right? In a traditional sense, especially the background vocals are all way off and etc. But it's perfect, right? Don't touch it. It just seems to fit, right? Now, while I do find the high-selling Razor's Edge, the Razor's Edge, it was put out in 1990, sorry, to be a slight deterioration towards overproduction, courtesy of Bruce Fairbairn, who did it, was a little more like Mutt Lange. AC/DC's other more contemporary albums have avoided blatant Langeisms, if I can put it that way. Producer Rick Rubin, always a preacher of back to basics. I think he fit really well for Ball Breaker that came out in 95. And Brandon O'Brien has been at the helm, the producer for the band's most recent 3 releases, right? So Black Ice, Rocker Buster, Power Up, just released just a couple of years ago. His clear but no frills method has been more than satisfactory, right? So I have no problem with the way any of those albums sound as well. But for me, I still don't think anyone has captured the essence of AC/DC as well as Vanda and Yun in particular. And just to reiterate a little bit of this, quick little look at this little table I put together. So here's AC/DC's studio albums, and here are the producers, right? So you can see there's a whole lot of Vanda and Yun and Yun and Yun, right? So as I was saying, everything before Highway to Hell is all Vanda and Yun, whether it be, you know, the North American high voltage compilations, whatever. It's all Vanda and Yun. Then here's the Lange Island, right? Highway to Hell, Back in Black, for those about to rock, where he really sweetened their sound. Sold a lot. I'll get to that in a second, but sweetened their sound, I think, in a lot of ways. Then we're back to the grittier sounding production of AC/DC. Albums didn't sell as well, though, in fairness. So you got Malcolm and Angus producing the next couple, and then Vanda and Yun return for Blow Up Your Video. Then Bruce Fairbairn does Razor's Edge, and probably one of their biggest selling albums yet again, right? And I would argue a little overproduced as well. And then we get Rick Rubin, like I say, a back to basics producer. Rick Rubin, that's kind of his thing, especially with classic bands, whether it be Black Sabbath or ZZ Top or Foghat, you name it. He's always encouraging bands to go back, you know, back where they started, so to speak. So it's not surprising that Rick Rubin's production of Ball Breaker sounds a lot like what Vanda and Yun did. And then George Yun produces Stiff Upper Lip. So again, you're back to that style. And I would argue O'Brien, who's produced their last 3, yeah, they're a little clearer, maybe a little more pristine than what Vanda and Yun did, but not to the point where I find it irritating, frankly. It still sounds very much like AC/DC. So to me, it's the Lange stuff and to some degree the Fairbairn stuff that I have a problem with, right? Personally. Okay, but maybe not lots of others. And let's talk about that, because we are back to an age-old dilemma. No album that sounds as genuine and raw, let's be honest, as say Flick of the Switch or Let There Be Rock could ever sell whether that be physical product, vinyl, CDs, or downloads, or nowadays streams, could never sell as much as Back in Black, no matter how potent the performance is. That is true. I don't deny that. The mainstream seems to require lots of smooth processing and familiar production techniques. That's just what mainstream audiences basically thrive on. So for people who enjoy, say, only the Back in Black album and maybe add in a couple hits, Thunderstruck, Who Made Who, maybe the song Highway to Hell, the Mutt Lange pop compatibility style is probably necessary for their consumption. And if you're that type of person, that's cool. I'm certainly not saying there's a problem there, right? But I am also saying I am sure that many deep AC/DC fans and or people committed to hard rock and metal understand how synchronized Vanda and Young's raw production aesthetics are with a gritty band such as AC/DC. I'm sure I'm not alone in wondering what the demos for Highway to Hell, Back in Black, and For Those About to Rock sound like. I've never heard them. I don't think they've ever been released, but I'd love to hear. I bet you I'd love them, right? I mean, given the superiority of various live versions of these songs, which I have tons of, right? I bet these tracks would sound glorious with a lot less Lange, right? But that's just me, right? Like I say, lots of people would disagree because these are their biggest selling albums. Okay. All right. So let's generalize this a little bit because I think there is some really interesting contrast between hard rock and heavy metal here, right? It's somewhat paradoxical that in spite of the adventurous nature of most forms of heavy metal, let me stop there for a second, because I've made this point in my other essays and other YouTube presentations, and I'll say it forever. I believe heavy metal to be amongst the most innovative forms of music on the planet, full stop, like rivaled only maybe by, freeform jazz or something like that, right? Some of the most forward-thinking, innovative musicians and artists in the world are metal people. So I will say that forever. But here's the thing. In spite of how adventurous most forms of heavy metal is, right, a more conservative production approach is often very appropriate for metal, right? Black metal's periodic fixation with necro sounds being the notable exception, as I talk about a lot in part 2 of this series. So check that out if you're interested. But for example, the majority of metal bands over the last few decades, especially slotted into thrash metal or death metal, have favored rather pristine productions. Okay, with maybe a lack of bass being perhaps the only consistent complaint, and not all the time. There, especially in thrash, there are some bands, that okay, where'd the bass go? But lots of times that's not true. But yeah, that can be a bit of an issue. But otherwise, very conventional, very pristine productions, right? Now, prog metal or progressive music in general thrives on highly transparent mixes, smooth tones, and well-developed sound stages, right? I mean, that makes sense. And so a real crystal clear, pristine, conventional production for prog, that seems to make sense as well in a lot of ways, and indeed prog metal also. Even current albums by many doom and stoner metal bands, while historically dwelling in the murk, usually their production used to be really murky, right? Not so much anymore. Lots of these bands even have embraced productions that are actually quite orthodox, right? And again, I think it actually fits. To my ears at least, movement towards convention, speaking solely in terms of sound quality, or I'm talking again how the albums sound, not the performances, which can still be very unconventional, but the way they're produced, this movement towards convention has not constituted any type of barrier for most metal artists. In fact, probably just the opposite. Sharper clarity in the recordings illuminate the incredible musicianship and allows the listener to better comprehend song and performance complexities inherent to many forms of metal. Hey, a really crystal clean production on some of these very innovative metal bands actually helps. It illuminates how incredibly great they are as musicians because you can really hear what they're doing. But again, given how complex a lot of the songs are, it helps the listeners sort of latch on to what they're doing better too, right? So movement towards convention purely in production for metal has actually been an okay thing, or in some cases a great thing, right? Not so for hard rock, I would argue, in most cases. Not so. When hard rock bands become too polished, that's when the trouble hits in a lot of cases, or at least for a lot of longtime fans anyway. Now, I've argued the AC/DC case above, but you know what? I could really say the same thing for countless other hard rock bands that embraced highly refined production approaches and frankly became really watered down as a result. That it almost never was good, at least for me, in spite of the fact that they might have sold a lot. But again, I never liked when hard rock bands became too conventional in production. It almost always went the opposite, at least for me, right? Now, for some, it was a comparatively short-lived period, such as AC/DC, right? AC/DC did it with Mutt, then kind of pulled out of it, maybe got into it a little bit with Razor's Edge, but generally speaking, they kind of got out of that, I think, right? Where others, once they went into pristine production, never really pulled out of it. Sadly, Aerosmith, I would say, would be an example. Similar stories could be told for Alice Cooper, Kiss, ZZ Top, Ted Nugent, Y&T, Motley Crue, Whitesnake, Def Leppard, et cetera, et cetera. Now, again, in some cases, the embracing pristine production was short-lived. I mean, for Alice, I think it was reasonably short-lived. For ZZ Top, it was. For Nugent, it was. But then others never really pulled out of it. Motley never entirely pulled out of it. Whitesnake didn't. Def Leppard certainly did. And once they were in, they were in. Same with Aerosmith, et cetera, right? But importantly, though, when these artists employed producers and engineers that enforced perfect pop-like methods, they often sold a whole lot of records, right? I mean, ZZ Top's period when they got really overproduced, Eliminator, I mean, again, probably top 10 best-selling album of all time, right? When Alice Cooper did it with Trash, again, one of his biggest selling albums, especially outside of the early 70s stuff. You know, and on it goes. I mean, look at how many albums, you know, Whitesnake and Def Leppard sold when they really got pristine, right? So again, a lot of people like this, right? So who's really right here? You know, I have previous papers, see particularly the underrated fallacy that I wrote about a year ago. And then I've got YouTube presentations as well. A good example would be the Alice's, meaning Alice Cooper, Alice's hair metal adventure, that expand on these themes. So consult these if you're interested. But I mean, there's always been this uneasy relationship between hard rock and commercialism, right? Hard rock becoming too catchy or produced a little too sweetly. So this has always been a push and pull thing. And check out those other areas if you're interested, where I talk about this stuff quite a bit more. Okay, so just to wrap this up, I should yet again emphasize the subjectivity inherent to ideas surrounding what constitutes a good sounding recording, and really if such topics even spark much widespread debate, all right? Because in fairness, there are listeners, and I suspect a lot of listeners these days, given that a lot of people just consume music on their phones, who do not get particularly excited by the overall sound quality of a recording and just focus on the tunes. Again, I do not mean that in any put down whatsoever, but I know a lot of people, they consume music on fairly inexpensive equipment, just on their phones or whatever. So sound isn't really an issue for them. Overproduction, yeah, whatever, right? As long as the music's reasonably clear, I'm just interested in the tunes, okay? I'm not going to get too hung up about it. It's not raw enough, whatever. It just doesn't matter to a lot of folks, and that's fair enough, okay? But I also got to say, I think that those fans of heavy metal and hard rock that do care about sound quality and production and etc., adequate transparency, tone, and soundstage can add to their listening experiences. So again, for more development on that, see part 1 of this series. Much of the controversy arises with bands that deliberately explore unconventional means of getting their art across, such as, you know, various albums by Black Sabbath and Darkthrone and others, right? As I talk about in part 2. Right? And or the controversy arises with albums that are arguably too polished, as I've been talking about in this section, right? Okay. Again, good examples would be Aerosmith, Def Leppard, right? And then a period of AC/DC, as we talked about. Got to remember, good sounding and appropriate sounding are very different things, right? And this can split the universe of serious music connoisseurs really right in half. For example, there are likely just as many longtime Black Sabbath fans calling for a remix to fix Born Again as there are folks like me who are just fine with it the way it is. So this isn't the pop audience. This is longtime hardcore Sabbath fans that can't stand the way, Born Again sounds, right? And then there's other people like me that are like, hey, just leave it alone. It's fine, right? And I also should mention, it would be completely disingenuous to imply that all hardcore Aerosmith fans have a problem with their transition into glossier pastures, right? That just wouldn't be true. And Aerosmith got glossier really anything after Done with Mirrors, anything after 1985. Aerosmith definitely went for a more pristine, poppier approach, right? Because in fairness, it's not just pop audiences that are buying or streaming these records, okay? So I don't want to employ that. There's lots of long-term Aerosmith fans, hardcore fans that know their catalog inside and out that have no problem with albums like Pump and Get a Grip and maybe even perhaps Nine Lives and et cetera, right? I mean, I would be one of those. I like the earlier stuff the best by far. I could talk all day about how great Rocks and Get Your Wings and their first album and Draw the Line are, right? But I like the later stuff too. And I am a hardcore Aerosmith fan, right? So I don't want to imply that it's an all or nothing thing, right? Because it isn't. So at least for some of us, the debate rages on, right? Another related and divisive issue that preoccupies the heavy metal and hard rock community concerns the degree of authenticity that should be applied to concerts and live recordings. That's the focus of my next YouTube presentation, which I hope you'll check out. But just a quick little spoiler, I guess. There's always been, I think, this trade-off between bands, artists, whatever, trying to achieve really good sound, but sometimes at the expense of authenticity, right? And this also translates into the live environment, right? By seeking really good sound, are we willing to accept when we see a live performance that they're going to use a lot of backing tracks, or to present a really good sounding live album, right? Are we willing to accept that really the album's not that live after all, that there were a lot of overdubs done in the studio, right? For some, it's a no-go. I want it to sound as authentic as possible. Others just say, hey, if you got to tweak these things to make them sound better, go for it, right? That's what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of YouTube presentations. Some of the most, I would say, controversial areas in hard rock and heavy metal today. Hope you'll check that out. In the meantime, stay happy, stay healthy, stay heavy.